In December 1999, as the clock ticked down towards a new millennium, everything seemed pretty rosy in the US of A. The Cold War was over, and seemingly the US had won. With Germany now reunified and Russia now a federal democracy, the anxieties of the last half a century had evaporated, and in their place, there was only optimism. It appeared that Francis Fukuyama's assertion had come true. The West's liberal democracy was the single most logical form of government. The United States now saw itself as the model that all else would follow. But all of this would mean nothing without a strong economy. Unfortunately, the US had that too. Rapid economic growth and a surging GDP meant more money, more opportunity, more power. And this economy was largely based upon the US's wildly successful private businesses. Private businesses like Enron. Amid the fireworks of Times Square and the popping of champagne corks across the century, the new millennium arrived. It was a new era in which America would lead the way. But fast forward 1 year and all that had begun to fall apart. The heady, unchecked optimism of the night before had given way to the cold reality of the morning after, and the bitter realization that it was all built on nothing. There was something rotten in the United States of America, and that something was Enron. The Enron story began in 1985. Riding high on a thriving economy, Houston Natural Gas merged with Internorth to create a new natural gas pipeline entity. Enron was born, with Missouri-based businessman Kenneth Lay at its head. Over the next decade and a half, Enron would go from strength to strength. Working with Jeff Skilling, a 34-year-old energy consultant from McKinsey, Enron began creating a forward market in natural gas, expanding their scope from a single pipeline operation to become active commodity traders. Skilling was hired full-time as chairman and CEO of Enron Finance Corp in 1989 and would oversee the company's program of diversification. This diversification was a huge part of Enron's rapid growth in the 1990s. Throughout the decade, Enron moved into a number of new areas. They purchased Wessex Water in the UK for $2.2 billion in 1998, and in November 1999, they were ahead of the digital curve with the launch of Enron Online, the world's first global commodity trading platform. On the eye of the new millennium, Enron was sitting pretty. It wasn't quite bothering the big hitters of Microsoft and General Electric and the market capitalism labels, but it was one of America's many business success stories, and it was ready to drive the US economy forwards in a new era of global dominance. But while all this was going on, Enron was making the moves that would be its undoing. Back in 1993, Enron had joined forces with CalPERS, the California State Pension Fund. Together, they'd created the Joint Energy Development Investments, or JEDI for short. 4 years later, in November 1997, Skilling had gone back to CalPERS with a new offer to join forces on another investment partnership. CalPERS was receptive to this, but on one condition. Enron would need to buy CalPERS out of the JEDI partnership, and this was a problem because it would show as a loss on Enron's balance sheet. To get around this, Enron immediately sold their freshly purchased stake in JEDI to a limited partnership called Chuco, named after Chewbacca from Star Wars. But this wasn't simply a case of companies with George Lucas-inspired names sticking together. Chuco was a special purpose entity created by Enron Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow. Basically, Enron had sold their stake in JEDI to themselves. This meant that JEDI losses would not appear on the Enron books, a dangerous precedent and the first layer in an increasingly precarious house of cards. It was very much in Fastow's interest to do this. Enron operated a system of generous performance-related bonuses and incentives for executives. The corporation culture became all about the here and now, prioritizing short-term stock prices over long-term sustainability. Special purpose entities were ideal for this approach. So it's not surprising that Enron would use this technique again and again over the next 2 years. In December 1997, Enron created White Wing, putting up around $500 million of their own capital, matched by $500 million from an external investor. White Wing began buying up Enron assets, ranging from physical assets like gas pipelines to stocks and shares. Again, this meant Enron was essentially selling assets to itself, something that looks great on a balance sheet, but it's actually pretty shady in practice. By now, Fastow was convinced that all this was a good idea. In 1999, he created 2 more limited partnerships named LJM Cayman and LJM2 Co-Investment. Through these outside partnerships, he he set about purchasing Enron stocks and stakes. All of this is a case of financial sleight of hand. It's a smoke and mirrors exercise designed to make Enron appear like a high performer. In fact, all Fastow was really doing was moving assets back and forward within an increasingly complex and opaque corporate structure, and massaging the balance books and stock prices in the process. But as the clock ticked down to January 1st, 2000, no one was too worried about Jedi and Chuko and White Wing and LJM2 or any other barely sensible collection of letters and numbers. The new millennium was here, and optimism was on the menu. Little things like corporate ethics and governance could take a backseat. The 1990s had been kind to Enron, but the year 2000 was off the scale. The company posted revenues of $100.8 billion in 2000, a 150% increase on the previous year, and a 750% increase on 1996. And with a political shift now taking place, things look to be getting better than ever. The Democratic President Bill Clinton was reaching the end of his term, and thoughts now turned towards who would be coming next. Clinton had been a useful Democrat for the corporate world. His policy of financial deregulation helped fuel much of the Wild West atmosphere of business in the 1990s. But the same could not be said for his vice president, Al Gore. Many doubted that Gore would continue this policy of deregulation, and as a committed environmentalist, a Gore presidency could spell disaster for a non-renewable energy company like Enron. So, for Kenneth Lay and Enron, there was only one possible candidate, the Republican George W. Bush, son of Clinton's predecessor, George H.W. Bush. It's not surprising that Lay threw his hat in with Bush. Lay was a friend of the Bush family. He'd supported George W.'s father, contributing to his campaigns, and even serving as co-chairman in Bush Sr.'s ill-fated re-election push in 1992. While Bush Jr. had been governor of Texas, Lay had helped Bush develop his education plan whilst also giving him a lot of money. And it really was a lot of money. Kenneth and his wife Linda donated almost $800,000 to Republican candidates between 1989 and 2001, most of which went to members of the Bush family. They did also donate to Democrats on occasion, but these donations added up to just 1/10 of the money that they pledged to the Republican Party. This was another dangerous precedent. Lay and Enron had become worryingly entwined with this rising political star. Bush referred to Lay as Kenny Boy, an embarrassingly familiar nickname that would come back to haunt the president in the coming years. But again, this was a problem to be pushed down and repressed, something to forget about for now and worry about later. Because in the first year of the new millennium, things were looking great at Enron. In August, their share prices hit $90.56, an all-time record for the company. Fortune magazine described these stocks as among the top 10 to last the decade. In a bold statement that would prove woefully inaccurate, Fortune said, Enron stocks should put your retirement account in good stead and protect you from these recurring nightmares about stocks that got away. So, more and more investors pumped their money into Enron with no idea about what lay in store. In December, George Bush was declared the winner of the 2000 presidential election. Even a drawn-out recount process in Florida couldn't dampen the flames of enthusiasm from the Republicans. Gore eventually considered the race 5 weeks after polling day. Enron had their man in the White House and business was booming. But by February 2001, barely 2 weeks after Bush's inauguration, the wheels were beginning to fall off. Arthur Andersen LLP was an accounting and auditing firm operating out of Chicago in Illinois. For close to 9 decades, the company had been at the pinnacle of the US accountancy profession and had established themselves as trusted experts in the field. By February 5th, Arthur Andersen was seriously concerned about what they were finding in Enron's records. All these special purpose entities designed to hide losses and conceal debts set alarm bells ringing at Andersen. So much so that the accountancy firm began considering whether they should drop Enron as clients. Andersen's executives decided to stick by Enron. They would say nothing about the company's shady practices, and this would turn out to be a fatal move from Andersen. So, investors had no idea what was going on behind the scenes, and Enron's stock value remained high. Meanwhile, Jeff Skilling moved up a position, replacing Lay as Enron's chief executive. Then, on March 5th, came an article that no one could fail to take notice of. Bethany McLean's piece for Fortune magazine. In the article, McLean compared Enron's stock prices to the fame of it girls like Jennifer Lopez and Kate Hudson. She labelled it an it stock. While tech stocks were booming at the box office last year, fans couldn't get enough of Enron, whose shares returned 89%, McLean wrote. But, as she continued, this success was built on shaky ground. That diversification that had been such a driver of growth was suddenly called into question. Let's start with a pretty straightforward question. How exactly does Enron make its money, McLean wrote. Details are hard to come by because Enron keeps many of the specifics confidential for what it terms competitive reasons. And the numbers that Enron does present are often extremely complicated. When she put this pretty straightforward question to Standard & Poor analyst Todd Shipman, he replied with a laugh, "If you figure it out, let me know." The very publication that encouraged people to pump their savings into Enron barely 6 months earlier was now tearing the company down. McLean's article shook investor confidence to the core. The dot-com crash of the previous year was still unfolding, wreaking havoc on investments. Companies like Cisco and Intel had seen their stock prices plunge by more than 80%, wiping out life savings and sending investors into panic. Fearful that the same thing was going to happen with Enron, some investors pulled their money out. Stock prices fell by nearly $20 to around $75 apiece by the beginning of March. Enron's status as the darlings of the burgeoning US economy was beginning to crumble, and as spring became summer, it became increasingly clear that not all was well with the company. On August 14th, after only 6 months on the job, Skilling tendered his resignation. While the resignation was abrupt, it was not wholly surprising. Skilling had shown himself to be a bit of a hothead, nervously obstructing any attempt to pry into Enron's corporate structure. Back in April, he'd grown annoyed when Wall Street analyst Richard Grubman complained, "You're the only financial institution that can't come up with a balance sheet or cash flow statement after earnings." Skilling's response was succinct. "Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that, arsehole." So, Lay was back in the hot seat as chief executive, and he was quick to allay any concerns. Skilling's resignation was for personal reasons, Lay reassured worried investors, and there were no issues at all with the way Enron was being run. "I never felt better about the company," Lay told stock analysts. When the analysts asked for more transparency, he batted away their concerns. Unconvinced, analysts lowered Enron's stock rating. 1 year on from the record high of August 2000, the price slumped to $39.55 per stock. This was a huge blow, and some Enron executives began to panic. The following day, Lay received an anonymous memo from within the organization. The memo warned that the company's accounting practices were about to backfire in a big way. There was now a real risk that, quote, Enron could implode in a wave of accounting scandals. The author of this warning was one of Enron's vice presidents, Sharon Watkins, and Watkins would be key to the progression of the case. But if Lay was worried, he didn't show it because Enron had an ace up their sleeve. Their close association with the Republican Party and with President Bush, surely, with friends in the White House, Enron couldn't collapse. Throughout the summer of 2001, Lay'd been meeting with Bush's VP Dick Cheney and with energy policy officials. It's believed Lay conducted 6 of these meetings, shoring up his position with friends in government and shaping energy policy in a way that would support Enron's interests. But as summer faded away, everything changed. On September the 11th, 2001, a series of attacks in the US left almost 3,000 people dead and precipitated the War on Terror. By October, Bush's approval rating had soared to an unprecedented 90%, and coalition troops were on the ground in Afghanistan. The US government had bigger fish to fry than protecting an old ally in business, especially one about to be tarnished by a massive scandal. In fact, it was better for Bush and his team to just wash their hands of the whole affair. The White House then began to assess the situation. Would the collapse of Enron really damage the United States economy in a meaningful way? They concluded no, it wouldn't, and so Enron found themselves isolated. October 2001 seems to be the month that everyone realized the game was up. First, Anderson lawyer Nancy Temple sent an email to one of the accountancy firm's executives on October 12th, encouraging him to destroy Enron records. 4 days later, aware that their attempts to obfuscate their balance sheets were about to be exposed, Enron attempted to get ahead of the story and reported a $618 million loss in the third quarter of 2001. One by one, investors who had stuck around began to cut their losses and abandon ship. Shareholder equity dropped by an astonishing $1.2 billion as stock prices plummeted to $33.84. But there was worse to come. Enron's belated attempt to avoid disaster had alerted the Securities and Exchange Commission that something big was going on. On October 22nd, the SEC announced they were investigating Enron, slashing another 20% off their share prices in the process. While under investigation, Enron continually tried to distance themselves from their shady past. On October 24th, Andrew Fastow, the architect of the Special Purpose Entity Strategy, was removed from his position as Enron's chief financial officer. officer. But if Lay and Enron thought that sacking Fastow was going to save them, they were wrong. The sharks were now circling. On October 26th, the Wall Street Journal ran an article that exposed the Chuco stealth partnership. This wiped a further 50% of the stock value, and the shares closed out the day at $15.40 apiece. Lay was now in a panic. He reached out to Alan Greenspan, the Fed chairman, the first of many desperate calls to people in power. Over the next weeks, he would repeatedly call Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and Commerce Secretary Donald Evans requesting urgent assistance, with the government now distancing themselves from the whole mess. That assistance was not going to come. In November, Enron was forced to finally come clean on its structuring. Executives admitted that they'd been overstating their profits for 4 years since the partnership with Chuco in 1997 and hiding their debts to artificially inflate the price of their stock. Enron's admission of guilt put Arthur Andersen under scrutiny. If Enron had been hiding debts and losses with shady accounting, how could their auditors have missed it? Of course, they hadn't missed it. Arthur Andersen had known about it for at least 9 months and said nothing. So the SEC expanded its investigation on November 29th. Arthur Andersen was now in the firing line. With nowhere left to turn, Enron filed for bankruptcy on December 2nd. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history. Their stock was worth just 26 cents. As a business concern, Enron was now finished. Lifelines from creditors and a buyout deal enabled the company to stumble on, but it was a shell of its former self. The Enron dream was over. But the Enron saga was far from over. In fact, it was just about to enter a new phase. Under investigation from the SEC, Arthur Andersen's CEO, Joseph Berardino, testified to finding possible illegal acts while auditing Enron, illegal acts that were not disclosed. This is enough for the Justice Department. By January, they'd launched their own criminal investigation. Key to this investigation was Sharon Watkins, who warned Kenneth Lay about dodgy accounting practices back in August. While some questioned why Watkins had not gone to the authorities with her concerns, her evidence was nonetheless invaluable. With high-profile witnesses now giving evidence, the writing was on the wall for Enron. Criminal trials were coming, and heads were gonna roll. Andrew Fastow and his wife Leah went on trial in 2004. Leah Fastow was indicted on 6 felony charges, but ended up receiving a single misdemeanor tax charge. Her husband, on the other hand, was charged with 98 felonies, ranging from conspiracy and money laundering to insider trading. Leah Fastow was sentenced to 1 year in prison for her role in the affair, but Andrew was looking at serious time. In the end, a deal was struck. He'd get a reduced sentence of 10 years without parole if he agreed to testify against Kenneth Lay and Jeff Skilling. Aged only 42, this gave Fastow another chance at life, and he took it. 2 years later, the trial of Lay and Skilling began. Their indictment ran 65 pages and covered almost every financial crime under the sun, including falsifying statements, laundering money, conducting insider trading, and carrying out securities fraud. Proceedings took 5 months. Throughout, Kenneth Lay remained defiant, claiming he'd been misinformed and badly advised by his executives. In particular, he blamed Fastow, claiming that Fastow's complex networks of special purpose entities had been built on his own accord. When questioned why the Enron board had okayed Fastow's transactions, he didn't have an answer. When the verdict finally came, it was damning. Skilling was convicted of 19 counts of securities fraud and wire fraud. For this, he received 24 years and 4 months in prison. Lay was also found guilty on all 6 of the counts he faced and told he could serve up to 45 years in prison for his crimes. But Kenneth Lay was never sentenced. The stress of the proceedings and the thought of spending the rest of his life in jail was too much. He died in Aspen, Colorado on July 5th, 2006 after a heart attack. As he died before he was sentenced, his conviction was overturned and the verdict was vacated. The vacated verdict would lead some to speculate that Lay wasn't really dead at all and had faked his own demise. T-shirts appeared bearing the slogan "Ken K lives." K's lawyer, Michael Ramsey, dismissed the rumours as garbage on the internet. Nonetheless, 21 people were eventually found guilty for crimes related to the Enron scandal. Arthur Andersen were found guilty of obstruction of justice after their astonishing decision to destroy all their documents related to Enron. The Supreme Court would later overturn this verdict, but it was too late. The damage was done. Forever tarnished by their association with Enron, Arthur Andersen went out of business. Analysts Baladaran and William Bufkins likened the Enron collapse to the sinking of the Titanic. Like the Titanic's reckless decision to race through iceberg-infested waters, Enron's management made increasingly larger investments into ill-conceived projects and businesses. And, like the Titanic's inadequate number of lifeboats, the management of Enron seemed to operate without adequate corporate controls and checks. Darwin and Bufkins also drew attention to the human cost of the Enron scandal. While many of Enron's executives served serious jail time, it was their innocent investors and employees who were left to foot the bill. Those who had been sold a dream of financial stability and a comfortable retirement were left with nothing. Countless lives were ruined by the unchecked chicanery of Enron's top executives. Enron's collapse is in many ways emblematic of the rise and fall that characterized that new millennium. The company's meteoric rise encapsulated much of the optimism of the 1990s, but also highlighted the crippling flaws in deregulation. As dawn broke on the new millennium, it quickly became clear that Enron's rise was built on flimsy foundations, and these flimsy foundations would have ramifications that extended way beyond the company and its shareholders. The Wild West atmosphere of corporate executives treating balance sheets and share prices like their personal playthings had begun under Clinton thanks to his deregulation of the markets, and this deregulation continued apace under Bush. While senior government figures got away from the scandal with their reputations just about intact, Bush's close association with Kenneth Lay meant his actions were also called into question. Many in the business community liked Bush because he was all about deregulation, while Bush liked them because they gave him lots of money. Once the Enron scandal had exposed the true impact of slack regulation, Bush felt impelled to change tack. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act brought in new regulations and new safeguards, but the SEC tried to extend regulation to mutual and hedge funds when they were blocked by the White House. Despite the warnings from Enron and the lengthy prison sentences, American financial service regulation remained lax throughout Bush's tenure, and cavalier practices were back on the agenda, particularly among mortgage lenders. As Bush's time in office neared its end in 2008, the whole thing was coming apart again. That year, the housing bubble burst, leaving millions of people with worthless properties and drowning in credit they could not afford to pay back. No lessons had been learnt from the Enron scandal. Just a few short years after the last scandal to rock the American financial industry, another one was looming. And while the last one had taken down companies and ruined investors, this one was going to impact the entire world.